Hemostatic control system. It means the control system involved in homeostasis. We have two types of control system in homeostasis. One is called intrinsic. It means within the organ. The best example when we are doing exercise. Exercising muscle consume more oxygen, and this will lead to decrease in oxygen level in exercising muscle. And this decrease in oxygen will lead to vasodilatation. It means increase in the diameter of the blood vessel. Increase in diameter of the blood vessel will lead to more blood flow. And this more blood flow is needed for the exercising muscle. So by this way, by factors released from the organ, in this case is the skeletal muscle, this factor will lead to an increase in the blood flow. So this is called intrinsic control. The other control system is called extrinsic. It means outside the organ. And this extrinsic control, usually it is done by nervous and endocrine system. So let us take an example for this extrinsic control of the homeostasis. If there is an increase in the blood pressure, this will lead to stimulation of certain receptor, and these receptors are called baroreceptors. These receptors will detect the increase in the blood pressure. The information from the blood vessel will be carried by the nervous system, nerve fibers, to the control system in the brain stem here. And from there, from the center, from the brainstem, impulses through nervous system going to the heart and to the blood vessel. To the heart, it will decrease the rate and contraction of the heart, and to the blood vessel, it will lead to vasodilatation. Both of these factors will lead to a decrease in the blood pressure. So the blood pressure will return to its normal level. Most of the control systems involved in homeostasis use the feedback mechanism. What is meant by feedback mechanism? It means that the response is made after the changes has been detected. For instance, a change in the blood pressure, an increase in the blood pressure. The change occurs and the response will occur after the change occurs and detected. As far as feedback mechanism is concerned, we have two types of feedback system. One is called negative feedback system, and the other one is called positive feedback mechanism. The negative feedback system of the homeostatic control system. First of all, most of the control system operate through this negative feedback mechanism. That's why it is the primary type of homeostatic control in our body. Why it is called negative? Because it opposes the initial changes. We will describe it later on in examples. Like all the control system, this negative feedback mechanism or system consists of three parts. First of all, sensor, which detect the changes in any variable in the body. For instance, increase or decrease in blood pressure, an increase in the concentration of hormones, an increase in electrolyte or decrease, an increase in pH, and so on. The other component of negative feedback mechanism is the control center. Control center. This control center will compare the sensor input, the information coming from the organ or from certain part of the body, with the set point, the normal point. The third component is the effector, and through the effector, the changes will occur. The response will be produced certain effect. Usually this effect is enough to correct the changes. So let us see this in this diagram. Here, as you can see, variable anything, blood pressure, body temperature, electrolyte concentration, hormone concentration in the body, and so on. If there is imbalance, a decrease or increase in certain concentration or value in the body, this imbalance, this changes, will be sensed or will be detected by receptor, the sensor here, the sensor. The sensor will send impulses to the control center through either nerve fiber or through hormones. And from the control system, orders going to the effector, and it will change or it will cause certain changes in the effector. And these changes will correct the imbalance in that variable. And this correction will retain the variable into normal condition. So this is the negative feedback mechanism. Again, the response here, the response is usually opposing the changes. If there is an increase in a variable, the response will be a decrease in variable. Definitely, because we need to balance or to oppose the changes. If the changes is increase, the response is decrease. That's why, or this is what is meant by opposing the initial changes. An example of negative feedback mechanism. Let us see this diagram, which explained the process of negative feedback mechanism. So let us see here, if we start from here. Suppose there is a deviation, a change in certain variable. For instance, blood pressure, body temperature, concentration of certain hormone, concentration of ions, pH, and so on. The changes will be detected by sensor, by receptors, and the changes will be, or the information about the changes will be sent to the integrator, to the control system. And this control system will send impulses or instruction or orders to the effector. And the effector will cause certain responses. And usually these responses will lead to restoring the normal condition. Once the normal condition is restored by negative feedback mechanism, it will stop this process because it inhibits any stimulation of the sensor once the normal condition is returned to normal. The best example for this, or the real example, is a fall in the body temperature. So let us see what's happened if the body temperature is reduced. Once the body temperature is reduced, this reduction in the body temperature will be detected by the nerve cell. or receptors for temperature. Impulses will go to the temperature control system, usually in the hypothalamus in the brain. And from the control center or temperature control system, impulses will go, for instance, to the skeletal muscle, causing them to contract, causing shivering. And this contraction of the muscle will lead to an increase in heat production. And this increase in heat production will inhibit the stimulation of the receptors. So this is a negative feedback mechanism. This is further explanation of negative feedback mechanism. And the best example is maintaining the constant body temperature by this negative feedback mechanism. So let us see what will happen if the temperature is increased more than normal. So in this case, the temperature is increased more than normal. This increase in the temperature more than normal will be detected by receptors, and impulses will go to the thermoregulation center in the brain. And from the center, impulses will go to the effector. For instance, in this diagram, impulses go to the sweaty glands, increasing the sweating. And other impulses will go to the blood vessel in the skin, lead to dilatation of these blood vessels in the skin. Both the increase in sweating and vasodilatation of the blood vessel in the skin will lead to a decrease in the body temperature to normal. So once the body temperature returns to normal, this stimulation will be stopped. So this is an example of negative feedback mechanism. If we take the other side of the story, when the body temperature is decreased below normal, again, this decrease in the body temperature will be detected by the receptors, and these receptors will send impulses to the center that regulate the body temperature. It's called thermoregulation center in the brain. Once this center is activated, it will send impulses again to the blood vessel and the skeletal muscle. Here, what we need to increase in the production of the heat and preservation of the heat. And this is done by constriction of the blood vessel in the skin. And this will decrease the heat loss. And impulses will go to the skeletal muscle, causing contraction. In other word, shivering, and this will generate heating. Generation of heating, decrease in the heat loss will lead to an increase in the body temperature, bringing back the body temperature to normal. Once the body temperature returns to normal, this cycle will be stopped. This is a negative feedback mechanism. As you can see again, if you remember the negative feedback mechanism, the response is opposite to the stimulus or the initiation factor. Here, the temperature is rising, the response, the temperature is decreased. Here, the change or the changes is the body temperature fall, the response is increase in body temperature. So as I said, in negative feedback mechanism, the response is opposing the stimulus or opposite to the stimulus. This is another example for negative feedback mechanism. and this is about blood pressure regulation. So let us see this diagram. Suppose the blood pressure is decreased below normal level. This decrease in the blood pressure will be detected by certain receptor, sensor. And these receptors usually are called baroreceptors in the carotid artery. The sensor will send impulses to the brain in the brainstem. In the brainstem, we have what is called circulatory center, integrator or integrative center. And from the center, impulses by sympathetic nerve fibers going to the heart, for instance, increasing the heart contraction, increasing the heart rate, and this will lead to an increase in the cardiac output. This increase in cardiac output will lead to an increase in the blood pressure to normal. Once the blood pressure returning to normal, it will stop this cycle by negative feedback mechanism. The positive feedback mechanism is the another type of feedback system for homeostatic control system. It is not common in our system. That's why it does not occur as often as negative feedback mechanism. If you remember, I said the negative feedback mechanism is the most common type of control system. The positive feedback mechanism, in this system, the response amplifies the initial changes. Give you an example. If the variable is increased, the response will further increase the variable. The best example is the uterine contraction during the labor. During labor, the uterine contraction become increasingly strong until the birth of the baby, and the cycle of the positive feedback mechanism will be stopped. As an example for positive feedback mechanism is the uterine contraction during the childbirth. This type of positive feedback mechanism is useful because it leads to birth of the baby. So let us see how this positive feedback mechanism occurs. During the labor, the baby is moving downward, and this will lead to stretching of the cervix. The stretching of the cervix will send impulses by the nerve fiber to the hypothalamus, and from the hypothalamus, impulses going to the posterior pituitary glands. Posterior pituitary gland secreting hormone. This hormone is called oxytocin. This oxytocin going into the blood and reaching to the uterus and causing more contraction. More contraction will lead to more movement of the baby downward, and this will lead to further stretching of the cervix, further increase in production of oxytocin, further increase in uterine contraction. This cycle will continue until the baby is born. Once the baby is born, the stretching of the cervix will become less. So there will be no more stretching of the cervix, and there is less formation of oxytocin and less contraction of the uterine contraction. And if you see this again in this diagram, here at the beginning of the labor, the baby is pushing against the cervix, and this leads to stretching of the cervix. And this stretching of the cervix will lead to liberation of impulses or sending impulses to the brain, to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland, the posterior pituitary gland, secreting oxytocin. And this oxytocin will cause more uterine contraction. More uterine contraction will lead to more stretching, more pushing of the baby downward, more stretching of the cervix, more impulses going to the pituitary gland, posterior pituitary gland, more oxytocin. So as you can see, the beginning of this cycle is uterine contraction, and this uterine contraction will lead to more uterine contraction during labor process. So this is a positive feedback mechanism, a useful positive feedback mechanism. And this useful feedback mechanism must be stopped. And usually it is stopped when the baby is born, as I mentioned before. Once the baby is born, the stretching of the cervix will be less, and this stretching of the cervix will lead to less secretion of oxytocin. Less secretion of oxytocin, it means less contraction of the uterus, and so on. Another example for useful positive feedback mechanism is seen in generation of the nerve fiber. When the nerve fiber is stimulated, there will be a movement of sodium ion from outside to inside. And this movement of sodium inside the nerve fiber will lead to change in the membrane potential. And this change in the membrane potential will lead to more sodium channel to be opened. And once these more sodium channels opened, it will lead to more change in the membrane potential. And this more change in the potential will lead to more opening of sodium channel until the action potential occurs. Once the action potential occurs, it will migrate or travel along the nerve fiber. So this is another example of useful positive feedback mechanism. Another example of positive feedback mechanism is seen during formation of blood clot. As you know, blood clot is useful to close the opening in the blood vessel. Suppose if there is injury to the blood vessel wall become rough, and this roughness in the blood vessel will lead to adherence of the platelets to that site. Adherence of the platelets will lead to release of the chemicals, and these chemicals released will activate more platelets. Activation of more platelets will lead to more attraction of platelets and more activation of platelets. So as you can see, the cycle continue until the platelets adhere to each other, forming what is called a platelets plug. And this platelets plug, as you can see, can close the opening in the injured blood vessel. Once this happened, this negative feedback mechanism will be stopped because there will be no more further stimulation of the platelets. This slide compares the negative feedback mechanism with the positive feedback mechanism. Most of these points I mentioned before, so let us go through them again. The negative feedback mechanism or in the negative feedback mechanism, the original stimulus is reversed. If the stimulus causing an increase, the response will be a decrease, and so on. In the positive feedback mechanism, the original stimulus is increased, intensified. That's why it is called positive. If the stimulus causing an increase, the response will cause further increase. Most of the feedback mechanism belongs to this type. The positive feedback mechanism is not common as negative feedback mechanism. The negative feedback mechanism is used for conditions that need frequent adjustment. For instance, blood pressure, body temperature, pH of the blood, concentration of hormones, concentration of ions, and so on. While the positive feedback mechanism occurs in certain conditions, for instance, normal childbirth or formation of a plate of clot or blood clot, and so on. So examples for negative feedback mechanism, so many examples. Almost most of the feedback mechanism belongs to this type of mechanism or feedback mechanism. Positive feedback mechanism operates in certain circumstances or in certain conditions. What happens when the homeostasis is disrupted? Homeostasis, if you remembered the definition, is controlling a stable condition in the body. So if this condition is disturbed, this will lead to problem in the body. And as you can see, when the homeostasis is disrupted, all the cells suffer, and sometimes it may cause death or at least illness. So let us see if an example for disruption of homeostasis. So let us take this example, losing of 2 liters of the blood. If there is this a great loss of blood from the body, this will lead to decrease in the blood pressure. This decrease in the blood pressure will decrease the blood flow to the heart. Decrease of the blood flow to the heart will lead to decrease in the heart pumping of the blood. It means less blood going to the body, and this will decrease the blood pressure more. Decreasing the blood pressure more will decrease the blood flow to the heart, and this will lead to less blood pumped from the heart, until if this cycle is not stopped, it will lead to stoppage of the heart. So the positive feedback mechanism could lead to a vicious cycle and may lead to death. And in this curve explains what's happened if the homeostasis is disturbed. So let us see it here. For instance, if the body lost 1 liter through negative feedback mechanism, the body can correct the situation by increasing the heart rate, increasing contraction in the blood vessel, and this will lead to retaining the blood pressure to the normal, or the pumping of the heart, pumping of blood from the heart. If there is bleeding of 2 liters, this much more bleeding will lead to further decrease in the ability of the heart to pump the blood. And as you can see, ability of the heart to pump blood is decreased gradually until it leads to death. So disruption of homeostasis will lead to illness and sometimes to death. Body fluid or body water. The body water is distributed between two compartments. One is called extracellular fluid. It means outside the cell. And the other compartment is called intracellular fluid, inside the cells. Water is the most abundant substance in the body. If you take how much blood is forming the percentage of water in the body, more than 60% of our body weight is water. The amount of water in different kind of tissue varies from one tissue to another. For instance, if you compared the skeletal muscle with the fat tissue, the skeletal muscle contains more water than the fat tissue, or skeletal muscle with the bone, and so on. Almost 2/3 of our body water is found inside the cell, inside or in the intracellular fluid compartment, and 1/3 of total body water is found outside the cell in the extracellular fluid. The extracellular fluid contains two compartments. One is called the plasma and one is called interstitial fluid compartment between the cells. 1/5 of extracellular fluid is found in the plasma, and 4/5 يعني 4/5 of the water of the extracellular fluid is found in the interstitial fluid compartment. We have a minor compartment. You can consider it extracellular fluid, but it is not. They called paracellular or transcellular fluid, for instance, lymph and the transcellular. This diagram shows the distribution of body fluid into two compartments, as we have seen in the previous slide, extracellular and intracellular fluid. Extracellular fluid is found in plasma and interstitial fluid and in transcellular fluid. The transcellular fluid is a small amount, and an example for transcellular fluid are cerebrospinal fluid. From the name, cerebrospinal fluid is found in the brain and in the spinal cord. Intraocular, inside the eye. Pleural, in the chest, between the lung and the chest wall. Peritoneal, in the peritoneal cavity. Synovial, in the joints, and the digestive secretions in the digestive tract. This diagram shows the distribution of the water in different compartments. This part represents the extracellular fluid, and this part represents intracellular fluid. And we put numbers here, the amount of a fluid. These numbers are representing the amount of water in a person of almost 70 kg, the body weight. You can see the partition or the barrier between the plasma and interstitial fluid is the capillary membrane, and the partition or the barrier between interstitial fluid and intracellular fluid is the capillary membrane. And as you can see, there is continuous movement of water between the two compartments. And you can see here the intake of water first will go to the plasma, and then it will be distributed to the interstitial fluid and going to the intracellular fluid. And the output of water from our body through different means: kidneys, through the urine, uh, through lungs, water vapor in our breath. Some water is lost from gastrointestinal tract in feces. Some water is lost through sweating, and some water is lost through the skin through diffusion. This diagram is the same as the previous one, and just to give you an idea about the capillary membrane, as you can see, the capillary membrane, this is the membrane. It is the partition between the plasma and the interstitial fluid, and as you can see, these are pores, and these pores can allow water and a small electrolyte going through. So everything in the plasma can pass through these pores except large molecules, large protein, and the cells of the blood. They can't leave or they can't pass through these pores. And the connection between the plasma and interstitial fluid, we have a lymphatic vessels which connect the interstitial fluid and the plasma. This table shows the amount of water in different compartments, and this is a 70 kg male. So let us see these. The total body water is almost 24 liters, or 60% of the body weight is water. The intracellular fluid is 40% of body weight. Extracellular fluid is 20% of the body weight. The plasma is 4% of the body weight. Interstitial fluid is 16% of the body weight. And if you translate these to actual liters, total body water 42, intracellular 28, extracellular 14, plasma is about 3, interstitial fluid is about 11 liters. These are some points about extracellular fluid. Of course, extracellular fluid is an intermediary between the cells and the external environment. So let us see these points. First of all, when the plasma is regulated, the volume of interstitial fluid is also regulated because they are connected together through the capillary membrane. The regulation of extracellular fluid and the regulation of osmolarity are closely related, because if the osmolarity is decreased, this will lead to less volume in extracellular fluid, and vice versa. If the osmolarity is increased, this will lead to more fluid in the extracellular fluid. Of course, the regulation of extracellular fluid helps to maintain blood pressure, because the plasma of the blood is part of the extracellular fluid. Of course, we have long-term regulation mechanism of blood pressure. The regulation of extracellular fluid osmolarity is important to maintain the cell volume. We will see it in the next slides. If we have salt in certain compartment in the body, This will lead to holding of water in that compartment, and vice versa. Less salt, for instance, in extracellular fluid lead to water loss from this compartment. This slide about the composition of the plasma, extracellular fluid, and intracellular fluid. We have seen that the barrier between the plasma and the blood vessel and interstitial fluid is the capillary membrane. And this capillary membrane is permeable to everything except the cells and the larger protein. So the composition of the plasma and extracellular fluid or interstitial fluid are almost similar, except of course here we have more protein, and in the interstitial fluid is less protein. And the barrier between the cells, intracellular fluid inside the cell, and the interstitial fluid is the cell membrane, and this cell membrane is selectively permeable. It is not allowing the movement of electrolyte through it, or easy movement of electrolyte through it. That's why the composition of intracellular fluid and interstitial fluid or extracellular fluid is quite different. This slide shows you the composition of electrolyte in different compartments. Here you can see the plasma, interstitial fluid, and intracellular fluid. And as you can see, the composition or the electrolyte composition of the plasma and interstitial fluid almost similar. While here, of course, when I said almost similar, you can see chloride here more, chloride more here, sodium here high, sodium high, potassium low, except the protein in the plasma is more than interstitial fluid. Here, the composition of intracellular fluid is quite different from the composition of interstitial fluid, as you can see. Here we have a lot of, here in the intracellular fluid we have a lot of potassium. Here we have a lot of sodium in the interstitial fluid. In intracellular fluid we have a lot of phosphate and protein anions. In the interstitial fluid we have a lot of chloride, negative ions, and bicarbonate. This slide is about osmolarity of a fluid. And osmolarity of a fluid means the concentration of solute particles in certain fluid. And the regulation of the osmolarity in the extracellular fluid is important for preventing the changes in the cell volume. If there is a difference in the concentration of the solute or non-penetrating solute between the two compartments, water will move. Water will move from low solute concentration to high solute concentration. We will see it in the next few slides. If there is excess water in the extracellular fluid, this will lead to hypotonic extracellular fluid. If there is less water in extracellular fluid, this will lead to hypotonic extracellular fluid. What happens if cells are put in hypertonic solution? They shrink. Shrinkage of the cell in hypertonic solution is not useful, especially for neurons, because shrinkage of neurons can affect the brain functions. The hypertonicity of extracellular fluid of our body can be caused by two major factors. First, insufficient water intake, less water intake, or excessive water loss from the body. The best example of excessive water loss from the body is seen in a condition called diabetes insipidus. This condition is caused by deficiency or less secretion of a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. If there is less antidiuretic hormone, the ability of the kidney to absorb water will be less. It means we are losing more fluid through the urine. And you can see here in this diagram, this is isotonic solution, normal concentration of ions, and the volume of the cell is almost normal. If these cells are put in hypertonic solution, concentrated or containing concentrated ions, water will move from the cell toward the extracellular fluid. This leads to shrinkage of the cells. Cells swell in hypotonic solution, and this diagram explains this fact. Here, a normal condition, normal concentration of electrolytes in the extracellular fluid, and the cell volumes is normal. If these cells are put in hypotonic solution, water will move from the extracellular fluid to the cell. This will lead to an increase in the size of the cell. The cell will swell, okay? Swelling of the cell. And this swelling of the cell is not good to our system, especially the neurons. The hypotonicity of extracellular fluid compartment can be caused by many factors, and these are some of these factors leading to hypotonicity of extracellular fluid. For instance, renal failure. It means the kidney are failing, and the kidney is important for excretion of excess water from the body. If this ability of kidneys to excrete water is lost, the water will stay in the body. This is called water retention. The other cause is rapid water intake. The third cause is excessive or excess secretion of antidiuretic hormone. The other name of this hormone is called vasopressin. And excessive secretion of antidiuretic hormone, it means less water excretion from the kidney.